Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ranae, and I'm from the Equality for Children campaign. And we're really happy to have you all here and looking forward to telling you a bit more about our campaign, why we started, and what we are trying to achieve. Also joining me tonight, we have Elaine, Mary, and Gearoid, who are all LGBT plus parents, same as myself, and they will tell you a bit about themselves a bit later on. So just to kind of kick off, Equality for Children is a campaign that was started last October, and our sole mission is to fight for legal rights of all children of LGBT plus parents in Ireland. This campaign was born of a need to finish, I suppose, what marriage equality started. You know, a few years back, we were granted legal equal rights, but despite the fact that we have marriage equality, that equality does not extend to our families, unfortunately. So I'm going to just start off a little bit by telling you about my story and how I ended up here and why I'm talking to you tonight. So my wife, Audrey, and I have two daughters, and Ava and Aria. And we got married in 2016 and had Ava in 2016 as well. And I suppose back then we were in this bubble of just this big love bubble. We were able to get married, we were able to have kids, and it was just a really great time to be Irish, I suppose. We, along with, I suppose, most of the country, assumed that once we had a child, we would be afforded the same treatment as every other married couple in Ireland. And it was actually only when I was about 8 months pregnant that we found out that when we had our child, that only I would be considered a legal parent, and my wife Audrey would have no legal connection to our child whatsoever. And that was fairly devastating. You know, bringing a child into the world, and just, you know, it's such a hard time anyways, becoming a parent for the first time, and then to have that thrust upon us. It was a really hard time. And I suppose that's when I started getting into, I suppose, campaigning and activism. And I never set out to do this, but I think for a lot of people who find themselves doing this sort of work, it's when you find yourself in that situation and you really have no other choice. And we had no choice but to fight for our children. So since that time, we had just been, you know, really trying to lobby the government and to share our story and talk to anyone really who would listen about the situation that we were in, because it basically meant that I am a married person, yet I'm viewed as a single parent to our children who we brought into the world together. And, you know, finding yourself in this situation, it meant that there were a lot of things that kind of came up and continue to come up. And it's something that we're reminded of on a daily basis, that we are not equal and that we are not treated as any other family in this country. One of the issues surrounding, you know, our families, and it's an issue that a lot of our families face, is the issue of travel. And this became very apparent to us last year when we were on a trip to Orlando, and there was a mix-up with my passport. Totally my bad. I didn't check the passports, and my American passport, because I have dual nationality, was out of date. So I was refused travel, and we decided that Audrey would go on with Ava, our older daughter, to Orlando, and I would stay at home with the baby and get an emergency passport. And, you know, this was all like this big hoopla, I suppose, and it didn't even occur to me until Audrey and Ava had gone through the security gates that Audrey is not legally allowed to travel with Ava. And that realization just hit me like a ton of bricks. And legally, they could have been stopped. legally she could have been refused travel, and thankfully no one questioned her, because obviously Ava is completely comfortable with her, and she's her mother, so no one questioned them. But if anyone had questioned them, we could have been in a very sticky situation. And that's just one of the many things that kind of come up for our families constantly. Something that is often said to me is, well, we can't lie on a birth certificate. And why do you want to lie on a birth certificate? Two women or two men can't biologically create a child. And the thing is that, as it currently stands, my children's birth certificates don't have any correct information on it. Because I gave birth to the kids, I am legally on their birth certificate as their mother. But I'm not their biological mother, because we used my wife's eggs to do a thing called reciprocal IVF. So my wife is actually their genetic parent, and there's no donor information on the birth certificate either. So, if we're talking about needing to have correct genetic information on the birth certificate, I'm all for that. And at the moment, the system that we have does not allow for that all of the time. So anyways, I'm going to stop waffling on about myself, and I'm going to ask Mary to join me. And maybe if you could just tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming a parent, and a little bit about yourself and your family.
Together for almost 8 years now, and we have a little boy, Freddie, and he was born last July. There he is, very small there. He's 10 months old now, so he's born last July. And I suppose from our perspective, the way we use it, or the process that we engaged in, was one where we used donor sperm, and Paula conceived using her own eggs in that respect. So she obviously carried Freddie, and we have, I suppose, always been aware of the legislation, because when we started the process, we were aware of the children and family relationships legislation. We were aware that when our child was born, that given the process that we had used, that I would not have any parental, I suppose, rights, or I wouldn't have any entitlements to guardianship over our son, until such time as the relevant sections of the legislation were enacted. Now, those actually were enacted on the 4th of May of this year, which was great to see and very welcome, I have to say, in our house. But there has been a delay in terms of the relief that I'm now entitled to, which is to a declaration of parentage in respect of Freddie. As I say, we were very aware of the legislation, so we knew that from the date of the commencement of these particular provisions, that you had to have, for instance, you had to conceive in a clinic in Ireland. You had to conceive using an unknown but traceable donor. You effectively had to be identified. I had to be identified as an intending parent in respect of the child. And I suppose we were aware that these provisions set out the requirements for, I suppose, qualification and recognition in terms of parentage later on. So as it stands, by virtue of my interpretation of the legislation, I'm entitled to now apply for a declaration of parentage, but those applications, I don't believe, have been advanced before any court as of yet, but I intend to try and get one up and going as soon as possible. Obviously, with COVID-19 and all of that, there's been a delay in terms of actually getting paperwork to the courts, like to the court offices and stuff like that, to make available to people like myself who want to actually make an application. And I suppose the significance of it, much like yourself, Ranae, is that, I mean, I've absolutely no rights or entitlements when it comes to my child. We went through a situation where we were abroad, and he was sick. He was in hospital. Now, thankfully, they didn't ask any questions. But I mean, I was in a difficult situation, if not, if they had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most of us have probably found ourselves in kind of situations been really bad, but thankfully it wasn't. And really, we shouldn't have to be in those situations. As I said, having babies is hard enough without throwing all of these extra complications on top of it. So you mentioned there, like, the people who are covered, and you are one of the people who will be covered by this new legislation. So who isn't then? Who's left out?
So basically, anyone who is not in a female same-sex relationship or in a heterosexual relationship, that will apply. In terms of the LGBT plus community, it's pretty much everybody else. We have there's two categories that the legislation now provides for. There's a retrospective, so what situations would have existed prior to the commencement of the legislation. And by situations that existed, that sounds terrible, it's very clinical, but I mean where children were conceived before the enactment of the legislation and born potentially before the enactment of the legislation, or the commencement, of the legislation, and then after, so pre-4th of May 2020 and post. And so I suppose if you look at going forward, what's the provision going forward? Essentially, what is included, or the situations that are included, are that your child was conceived in Ireland, conceived in a recognised Irish clinic that is regulated, I suppose, in terms of law, that child was born in Ireland, and that you have used an unknown but traceable donor. So in other words, when the child turns 18, that child will have the ability to find out the information that was on file for that particular donor at the time and potentially trace that donor. So we personally went for an open donor. So somebody who was open to that contact to be made by our child into the future. Some people might want that, but that for us, that's what we felt fit best. In terms then of the retrospective aspect. So if you consider, I suppose, what is the checklist that I've just gone through there, there's as was described by Elaine when we were chatting about it, it's almost like an amnesty in respect of certain aspects. So retrospectively, if you had conceived your child outside of the state, for instance, and you had used an unknown donor, you are covered by the legislation, let's put it that way. But your child must have been born in Ireland. Okay. So it's effectively, I mean, I suppose that now the conception obviously had to occur before the 4th of May 2020. Any conceptions after that, then they're dealt with by the prospective requirements. But there is that kind of amnesty, which was, I suppose, the legislation, an attempt by the legislature to try and encompass probably as many situations as they could possibly
I mean, unfortunately, they didn't encompass nearly enough, because, as you're saying, unless you meet all of these criteria, basically it's still the same. Only one of the parents will be a legal parent to their child, and so just to kind of give people an idea, that's all male-led families, so all gay dads, anyone who's done a home insemination, anyone who has had possibly meets all the criteria, except that their child was then born outside of the state, and then going
the donor. If they had a known donor.
Absolutely. So quite a few families would have a known donor, and then going forward, anyone who still chooses to create their family in any of these ways, or go abroad for treatment, or any of these other various paths to parenthood, their children will still not be covered. So it's quite a vast amount of families that are not covered, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, it's very male heavy on that side. Same-sex male couples, it's very heavy, on their side, in that there's no recognition.
There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you, Mary. I'm going to move on to Elaine. And Elaine, if you could just introduce yourself, a bit about yourself, your family, and why you started campaigning with Equality for Children.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Ranae. Hi, everyone. My name is Elaine Collin, and my partner and I, and now wife, Jenny, got together about 10 years ago, and we decided about 4 or 5 years into our relationship that we wanted to have children. We tried unsuccessfully, sadly, a few times with IUI with my wife, and we found it a very difficult and emotional process. We used a clinic in Dublin, and sadly it didn't take. So at that point, we decided to take a break. And the year after, marriage referendum happened. We got engaged, we got married, and we felt like we were ready in a good place to kind of look at this again. We reflected a lot on our previous journey and what our options might be, and we thought about what kind of situation would work best for us and our family going forward. And some of the things that were important to us or ideal for us would be that our child would have a connection to both of our families, and that our child would know her donor or his donor. So we were lucky enough to have someone in our life who could help us and who could be a donor. You probably hear a lot about families where a sister might donate an egg to another sister, where conception isn't possible. So we were lucky enough to have one of my wife's brothers to ask as a donor, and he said yes. He was honoured to be asked, and we were thrilled with that decision. It just felt like the right decision for us. So once we were armed with our new pathway, it felt like it was the right choice for us and for our child. We went back to that clinic in Dublin, and they couldn't help us. Having a known donor was not an option given their services. Obviously, they use known donors all the time because they provide services to heterosexual couples where the husband or partner may donate for IUI, but they didn't feel like they could offer that to us. So what they offered us, the only potential offer, which was kind of laughable, was if our donor donated his sperm to the sperm bank that they work with in Denmark and went through all the processes to donate to them, and then passed all the tests, and then we could buy that sperm from that bank through the clinic. That was the only way they could help us. So that seems like a very long and overcomplicated process, and potentially not successful because the donation would have to meet all their criteria then. So we tried some clinics in Belfast. That didn't work out either. So we were just kind of miffed at the whole situation, but still felt that this was the right decision for us. We spoke to a family lawyer about our situation, about what our conception plan would look like in terms of parental access, and she spelled it out very clearly. The CFRA wouldn't apply, and that we'd be fighting for equality. But it didn't deter us. We knew that Ireland was on the pathway to hopefully equality for all children, and that this was the right thing for our family. So there was an obvious solution in front of us. I didn't have a fertility problem, nor did our donor. The hoops we would have needed to go through in order to conceive via clinic seemed insurmountable and could have taken years. So there was a simple option available, and that was at-home insemination. It wasn't our first choice, but it became the only option that was viable for us. So we drew up and signed an agreement with our donor. We bought a kit on Amazon for €25, and after 2 attempts, I became pregnant. IUI and at-home IUI, it's not for everyone, but it was the right course for us in the end, and it worked out very well for us. So our little girl, Kate, she's on the screen there, was born on May 31st, 2018. She just turned 2. Our donor, her uncle, is very much involved in her life, as is all of her extended family, and she is so loved by so many people. And I often reflect on how we as a family would only be recognised by the state if we had chosen a donor we didn't know and had used the clinic, even though we didn't have fertility issues. I wouldn't change a thing about how our decisions around forming our family, and don't feel like the state should be able to impose their ideals on it either. It's such a significant intervention and into a private citizen's life to force a family formation and conception options. on a family. So we still feel like it was the right decision for us. We wouldn't change a thing. But sadly, we're still fighting for equality for our child.
Thank you, Elaine. That's a really beautiful way to conceive your child, and you can just tell how much love surrounds Kate. Could you just tell me, why is it so important that you both be on her birth certificate? Why is it so important?
Well, I mean, you've alluded to it already, Ranae, around the birth certificate. There's often a lot of confusion around the birth certificate and what it's for. And as you've said, it's not a biological certificate. It registers the birth of a child, and it names the person who gave birth to the child. And the only other person who has an automatic right to go on the birth cert is that person's husband. So in the case of, and I know Gearoid will go through it later as well, but in the case of a surrogate and her husband can go on a birth cert. Neither may have any biological connection to a child. So the birth cert in Ireland is how parental rights are automatically assigned. So that's why it's important for us. Our child is considered a child of a single parent at the moment. My wife is a legal stranger to her. And that has lots of impacts on us as a family.
Yeah. And I've said kind of about the issue of travel, and there's so many implications for our families. What about like the issue of money, like inheritance and tax, and just say on the other side of the family that is not recognized, because obviously if a parent is not recognized, grandparents are not recognized either, an extended family. So could you tell me a bit about that and how that might impact our families?
Yeah, hugely, actually. So Kate has a very large and extended family, grandparents, great uncles, aunts, huge families on both sides, who all adore her. And if she's in the position at some stage in her life to be willed anything, for example, from not only my wife, her other mother, by the way, but from extended family on my wife's side, she will be taxed as a stranger to that person. So she wouldn't be entitled to any of the tax or inheritance benefits that a family member would have.
Yeah. And I think that's something that people might not often think of. People immediately would kind of think of the medical implications, but like that's a huge, thing that might impact our children at some point, in the future. So why are you involved with EFC? Like, what are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that impacts us, and one of the other things that actually impacts us hugely, and why we're here is citizenship. My wife is American, and had she been recognised as a parent to our child when Kate was born, Kate would have access and rights to citizenship in the States. And whatever you might think about the US at the moment, that is a benefit that transfers from parent to child, that she can't avail of. The biggest reason that I'm involved with EFC, though, is because of that issue around state infringement on private lives. It's one thing not to recognise any LGBT families in Ireland or to give rights to children, but to specify that children have to be conceived using this exact formula or else they're not valid is quite another. So I've been miffed about that from the outset, and I just think, as you often say, Ranae, we're not equal until we're all equal, and leaving children, it's the children that are being left out here. Inequality and discrimination is transferring to our children, even though we thought we had come over the mountain on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, obviously this new legislation is very welcome, and it's going to bring great relief to many families. But for those of us who are left out, it's almost as if we've become more unequal than we were before.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Elaine. I'm gonna ask Gearoid if you could maybe tell us a bit about your journey to becoming parents and why you're here tonight.
Hi, Ranae. Hi, everybody. So I'm Gearoid Kenny Moore. I'm a gay dad. I live in North County Dublin, and together with my husband Seamus, we have two amazing kids. They're twins actually, a little boy called Sean and a little girl called Mary. Our journey to fertility is a pretty long and complex one. We got married back in 2016. We were civilly partnered before that. And ever since we met, children were always part of our hope, part of our dream. And we started at, like every family here tonight, we started at a disadvantage, but I think we started a little bit further back along the road than some families, even in the LGBT community, because the clinics in Ireland literally will not even allow us in the door to discuss fertility treatments and options. And the reason they take that position is that they obviously understand that for a gay couple to have a child, it will involve surrogacy, and they don't feel that they would be legally protected if they were to even have a proper discussion with gay dads about a surrogacy journey. So once we realized that back in 2015 we started, we knew that Ireland literally wasn't welcoming of us as parents, our potential parents, and any children that we had. And that, I have to say, really hurt me and annoyed me, because, you know, we're good people. We pay our taxes. We contribute to the community that we live in every single way. And just to be told kind of like, you're not welcome here and your children wouldn't be welcome by the infrastructure that exists in this state around fertility, that just really hurt. So anyway, what did we do to kind of get on the road to becoming parents? We went to Canada, and the reason we chose to go to Canada was because in Canada, surrogacy is completely open, it's completely transparent. The rights and responsibilities of everybody involved in a surrogacy journey are covered by law, and that appealed to us because it meant that there would be no grey areas. Now, just to be very clear, in Ireland, surrogacy is not illegal. It's just a concept that doesn't exist within the eyes of the law. So if we did decide to become parents through a surrogacy in Ireland, we would be trying to fit in with the laws that exist for heterosexual, in the main, married couples. So off we went to Canada. We chose an egg donor. We both chose to be sperm donors. And we found, after a couple of months of looking, an amazing woman called Ranae, who lived in Alberta in the western side of Canada, who was willing to carry kids for us. And her story was that she'd already had 3 children, and they had made a huge difference to her life, and a very positive difference to her life. And sadly for her, the husband that she had the children with was killed at a very young age in a car accident. And she just felt that one of the things that would give her a focus and a hope and something to get out of a very awful situation would be to give joy and hope to families who desperately wanted kids. So she kindly agreed to become our surrogate. And we were all excited. We knew loads of people who'd been to Canada. It had worked brilliantly for them. And we assumed that we were kind of next in line to have our kids. So we tried on 4 separate occasions through IVF and embryo transfer to have our children. But sadly, none of the transfers worked. And at the end of a 2-year journey in Canada, we'd run out of embryos and we'd run out of money. And we didn't have any kids, and we were absolutely devastated. Again, we checked back in Ireland to see if there was any way we could use a clinic here, and again, nothing had changed. None of the legislation that had been spoken about by the government had been enacted. So once again, we were back in square one, really. So we literally begged from family members because we'd run out of money. We borrowed money from them and from a bank, and we also sold some things. I was lucky enough to have a house that I could sell, and we sold it. And we went off this time to a clinic in the United States, and we created embryos again. And a friend of mine that I knew from years ago when I worked in London, a girl called Amara, who lives in Birmingham in England, she knew all about her journey and the 2 or 3 years of bad luck in Canada. So she agreed to come forward and be a surrogate for us. And she carried our twins, Sean and Mary, who you can see here in this photograph. And I'm happy to say that they were born at 38 weeks, happy, healthy, perfectly formed, in Birmingham in September of 2018. So they're just over 20 months, or they're just almost 21 months old at this stage. So that's me and that's my family.
Thank you so much, Gearoid. You could write a novel at this stage. That's quite a lot that you've gone through to have your children. Could you just give me an idea of, the ways in which it impacts your family, that the fact that you don't have a legal connection to both of your children and vice versa for your husband?
Yeah, so just to be very open and transparent, despite the fact that our kids are twins, I am the biological father of one of the kids. That's our little daughter. She's called Mary. And my husband, Seamus, is the biological father of the other twin. Now, we did that simply because we had to, because after lots of analysis and medical treatments and this, that, and the other, there was an issue with my sperm quality. So the chances of me conceiving healthy embryos were lower. So Seamus chose to be a sperm donor for the majority of our eggs, and I was a sperm donor for a small group of them. And then when it came to transfer, it was actually our surrogate who said we at this point we were, I gave you a version of our story, and actually, Ranae, that's a very short version because it went on for years. But at the point of getting to the transfer day, our surrogate said, like, guys, if you would like to have 2 kids, I will do that for you. I'll carry twins. So we were like, wow, do we really want to do that? Because we've not exactly been lucky in this journey, and what are the risks with having twins? But anyway, after lots of late night chats and thinking about it back and forth, we eventually decided to transfer 2 embryos. And as I mentioned, our 2 kids were born, and there they are in the photograph. But so the reality is the children's birth certs are as follows. I am on my daughter's birth cert together with our surrogate, and Seamus is on our son's birth cert together with the surrogate. And to touch on the points that you guys raised earlier, I mean, our surrogate is not genetically linked in any way to our children. And she laughs genuinely when she sees our birth certs, because she's of a completely different race and a completely different skin color to our kids. And she thinks it's hilarious that this legal document that's so sacrosanct within the Irish state actually says that she's their mother, because she doesn't feel like their mother. She never wants to be their mother. She wanted always to be their surrogate and to be part of their lives, but never to be responsible for them. So what ways does it impact us? Well, it impacts us, the first thing was, after a couple of months, as you know, you have to get your kids vaccinated, and we were delighted to do that. But our GP, despite being very open and helpful towards us as a family, said to us, guys, look, when it comes to the vaccination of your children, you both actually need to come on separate occasions to have them vaccinated, because I need you to sign, I need the biological dad to sign the consents needed. The non-biological, the non-legal parent can't do that. So, at the beginning also, when our daughter was born, she had a small issue that has since been cleared around her heart, and there was a couple of months there where we thought she actually had a serious condition, which she doesn't, thankfully. But again, our doctor said to us, look, when you're going for those appointments, because it's major stuff that we're talking about here, the biological dad needs to go. The non-biological dad can attend, but it'll be all down to the biological dad to decide what treatments will be available. When we are going to send our kids to school, each of us will need to give a note to the school saying that the other parent can pick the child up from school. So, this is the first 5 years of their lives, and we're already being told that there's things that both parents cannot do. And that's frustrating.
Yeah, and it just it just really hits home, like this is not something that you would ever have to go through were you not married to a man, you know.
Correct. Absolutely.
You know, and another thing, it really disproportionately affects gay dads. And you know, do your children have an international birth certificate? Because that's another thing that it really disproportionately affects gay dads, is like the issue of international birth certificates and the way that the Irish state would recognize an international birth certificate.
Yeah, so had our children been, so in the UK, the birth certificate process is the same at the beginning as in Ireland. So the person who gives birth must go on the birth cert, and the biological dad can then go on the birth cert. If we continue to live in the UK, we would be able to change that and have a new birth cert issued after a couple of months with both dads on that birth cert. Here in Ireland, of course, there's no provision to do that. In other countries, such as the United States and Canada, both dads can go on the birth cert from the very beginning. But when they come back to Ireland with birth certs that don't look, and I hate this word, normal in the eyes of the Irish state, they get in huge legal difficulties and administrative difficulties, because you know, you have to apply for a passport using a birth cert, you have to apply for a PPS number using a birth cert, you have to apply for children's allowance, and you need the child's birth cert. When they come to Ireland with a birth cert that shows two dads on it, they have to jump through literally months of bureaucracy in order to find a workaround, and they have to explain their story to countless people in government offices to explain their story, and they have to continuously justify how they ended up with this unusual birth cert. So yeah, I mean, plenty of heterosexual couples travel abroad for surrogacy after experiencing fertility issues. And in those situations, they typically, the intended parents, the male and female, can go on the birth cert. They can come back to Ireland and fall under the radar completely. Whereas two men or two women, and as you mentioned, it's disproportionately men, they stick out immediately and get into all sorts of just hassle and headache and stress.
So so like what you're saying is, like, for the most part, and I know that there are, like, obviously heterosexual families who don't fall under the radar and do find themselves in kind of similar legal tricky situations, but for the most part, like, if you were married to a woman and you had gone to the States or Canada for you know, for that sort of treatment, and you would come home with an international birth certificate, for the most part, the Irish state would kind of accept that. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just wouldn't be flagged. Whereas a birth cert with two men's name on it. I mean, when we applied for our passports for the kids, we submitted two birth certs that showed the same date of birth with two different dads from the same family. And immediately the passport, like, I would imagine that the application wasn't on a desk for more than 5 minutes before somebody rang us from the passport office. Yeah. And it was, you know, straight away it was sent up to somebody at a very senior level. And instead of the passport application taking a couple of weeks, ours took a couple of months. It wasn't through any reluctance on the passport office to help us. It just simply, it didn't fit with their process. And we were immediately kind of flagged as being a case that needed to be watched and managed very carefully.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I found, you know, when applying for things. It's not for lack of want on the people, you know, from the people who are granting these different documents, but there simply is no framework for them to help us.
Exactly. You know? They're trying to operate within the legal framework that exists and the various different processes that they follow. And our families, there's no process for us. There's no legal framework to support us. And as you say, and I would 100% concur, the people who are in those positions at government level try very hard to help us to get our passports, to get our PPS numbers, to get our child benefits. But their hands are tied by the legislation that they are working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to open it back up to everyone now. And we've talked a lot about kind of, you know, the legal implications of all of this, and something that we haven't, I suppose, touched so much on is, you know, the emotional impact that this has taken on all of our families, you know, on us as parents, and on our children, and on our extended families. I don't know, Elaine, would you like to kind of share a bit about how does this all make you feel?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of worry and stress that goes with being a parent in our community, sadly, because of all the things that could happen, that probably won't, that might not, but could. You know, so when I was pregnant, I drew up a will. I never thought I'd be drawing up a will in my 30s, but I drew up a will and had to speak to my parents and say, if anything happens to me, I want my wife and to have parental rights over Kate. But ultimately, that decision is going to fall with you as my parents. And they don't want to be in that position. I don't want them to be in that position, but that's the position that would happen. And people say, you know, things like, well, that will never happen. No one would do that to you. Like, you don't know that. You don't know that that won't happen. The world is in a very strange place at the moment. And I think family security has become more important than it ever was. Another, you know, likely situation would be, you know, when Kate grows older and when we're older and need medical treatment, or any of her relatives are unwell, she has no automatic rights to visit them or make medical decisions around them. And again, you might say, well, the nurse or doctor would never refuse a grandchild to see their grandparent. But you don't know that. And why should that nurse or doctor have the right to refuse them? So there are so many worries and stresses about those kinds of situations that, yeah, they might not happen, but they could happen. And we don't have any control or say in the matter. So I think that's kind of the ongoing thing. And that's the biggest thing in terms of my work in this area, is getting rid of that worry and stress on our family.
Yeah, I think even now it's a little bit more kind of hits home, doesn't it? You're in a pandemic and you have no legal rights to make any decision related to your child. So if there's a medical emergency, say for instance, Paula, God forbid, you know, was, you know, infirm due to, you know, COVID-19 or whatever it is, and then who's responsible for Freddie? I'm not, in the eyes of the law. As you say, you know, I'm a legal stranger. And it's frustrating to think that the only way that you can achieve guardianship outside of legislation in our situations is, you know, drawing up a will, testamentary guardianship, that kind of idea. It's, you know, it just seems absolutely bizarre in a world where we've managed to achieve marriage equality, yet we haven't managed to make the families of same-sex couples equal to any other family, you know, or it's frustrating.
Yeah.
It's quite frustrating.
It's a very unusual and bizarre situation that we all kind of find ourselves in. And you've kind of touched on it there, Mary, the issue of guardianship. And that was something I was going to ask. You know, what is the difference between guardianship and full parental rights? Because, you know, at the moment, if you have lived with your child for 2 years, you are eligible to apply for guardianship. And for those who don't qualify for this new legislation, that is an option that is available, but only until you've lived with your child for 2 years. So could you just explain what are the main differences?
Yeah, so I suppose in Ireland, in fairness, what would be termed as parental responsibility in the greater EU, that's guardianship here. I mean, it's effectively guardianship here, okay? And we have situations where you have, well, particularly before the legislation, the automatic guardians. That's the birth mother of the child. That is the married parents of a child, so the male and female. And then you had the male and female who have adopted the couple. The child, the male and female couple who've adopted the child, and a father who may be lawfully appointed. So he may be an unmarried father, but he's the father of the child from a biological perspective. So that would have been the automatic guardianship before the introduction of the legislation. Thankfully, as a result of the introduction of the legislation, we do have I suppose it takes into account, and again, from a female perspective, the concept of, civil partners, cohabiting couples, You do have a situation where, say, for instance, somebody marries a parent of a child. So you could have a situation where there's a male couple, they get married, and one of the couples is already a parent to a child. Then the spouse, the new spouse, who is a non-biological father, could potentially apply for guardianship in that respect. But in terms of automatic qualification, you don't have that when it comes to the same-sex couple scenario. As I said, in my situation now, what I'm entitled to get is a declaration of parentage. That's because my child was conceived and born prior to the enactment of the current legislation. Now, that's a court application. I have to go to court. I have to kind of file all of the relevant paperwork and prove that I was an intending parent and that I qualify under the legislation effectively. Going forward, however, if I was in the same situation again with Paula, I will be, it's considered to be, I'll be automatically qualify as a parent to a degree. Well, that's my interpretation of the legislation as it is. But it's yet to be seen whether when we walk into a registration office, to register the birth, whether it's going to be, just like a heterosexual couple coming in to register their child, whether they will take no issue with both of our names going on it, or will they require, all the documentation from the clinic and so on and so forth. But effectively, what guardianship is, it is the body of parental rights. Okay, so it's effectively, the duties, obligations that you would have towards the child, to the rearing of the child, to the making of important decisions around education, religion, providing consent for medical procedures or treatments, and as Elaine was just saying, passports, and kind of obtaining, I suppose, even obtaining the birth certificate in the first place. You have to kind of be entitled to guardianship. So it's a hugely significant body of rights that, for a long time, and until the 4th of May 2020, I had no right or entitlement to, unless I waited the 2 years of living with my partner and our child, and I could prove that I was involved in the day-to-day care of that particular child.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Elaine. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask about guardianship there, Mary, but it guardianship, just to be clear, is not the same as parental rights. It expires when the child turns 18. Any person can be appointed a guardian to a child. Say a grandmother could, a foster parent could. So it's not the same. While it is a welcome addition, it is not the same.
So, and that has to be clarified. Yes, and that's an excellent point. It does expire, and it expires when that child reaches the age of majority, so that they no longer, in the eyes of the law, require a guardian, so to speak. So
a lot of those issues that, Elaine, that you spoke about, about medical decisions, about tax inheritance, as the child gets older, if there is only guardianship in place, all of those issues would still apply, and there would be no legal connection between you and your child again. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's important to consider that, because it's like anything. When you have a child, your life it completely revolves around them, and everything you do for the rest of your life effectively is for them, and to try and maybe prepare some sort of a future for them, or something to leave, or a legacy of some description to leave. So it's hugely, I suppose, concerning around that side of it, that there are so many people who remain, and so many families who remain uncovered by the legislation and unprovided for in that context. And that protection is really, really important. And those rights, any child is entitled to have parents. If they have two parents, or, that love them, that care for them, that look after them, they're entitled to have that recognised and that family unit recognised. And they're entitled to all of the, the legal rights and entitlements that come with that, to include.
Yeah, absolutely. What I wanted to ask was about adoption, because that's something that a lot of people kind of would throw at me. They're like, well, why are you so obsessed with getting, parental rights and having your wife on the birth cert? Just have her adopt them. And, I know that we can't, in this country, you can't adopt your own child. that you've conceived through assisted human reproduction. Like we've asked, and we're not allowed. I don't believe we should have to, but if that was an option available to us, we absolutely would do whatever we could to just make sure that our children were safe and secure. So why is that? Why is adoption not considered a route for our families?
Well, I think that I definitely think that the legislature have kind of, they've almost separated it out, because as you know from the current legislation that's there were provisions in relation to, making provisions, in terms of guardianship around adoption and things like that. And they went off and they decided to, introduce the 2017 Act, the Adoption Amendment Act, which effectively repeals the provisions in the Child and Family Relationships Act, and it repeals the 2010, or it amends the previous legislation. So I think it's just the legislature have kind of, it's almost like they've separated it from our situations to a degree, and what the logic to that is, I don't know. I don't understand it, because as you say, if this was the way to go about it, if this was the easy way to make or to achieve equality, or to make it, kind of make it easy for people to access, then wouldn't this be the way to do it? But they seem to have just gone about it in a different way. So now the Child and Family Relationships Act, the provisions that related to adoption, they're now repealed because of the new Amendment Act. And in fairness, I'm no expert on that particular piece of legislation, but it just seems to me that for some reason they've just completely excluded this as a possibility for us. And again, because I don't understand why the current legislation that we have, and unfortunately it's kind of one of the reasons why it's such a complex area now, is I don't understand perhaps why there wasn't maybe a greater analysis of the types of families and the categories of families that exist in the LGBT plus community. Because if you had maybe done a kind of an in-depth investigation, and look, I suppose it's not an easy task either, but it was one that was clearly very necessary to try and encompass as many families as you could possibly encompass and cover in the legislation. But it seems to me that wasn't done either. So there's been a provision for, as we say, kind of like it's us as lesbian couples, we've benefited quite significantly from the legislation, whereas Gearoid situation, surrogacy is out on its own there now with the draft legislation. Again, that's a complete separate thing. Again, the legislature, I don't understand how maybe there wasn't a greater connection drawn between these, because it's very clear that a same-sex male couple have no other alternative but to use that avenue and that process. So it seems we've benefited as lesbian couples more so than anybody else in terms of the legislation, but that's such a small group of people, a small group of families compared to, the greater community. So it's one of the major difficulties with what's there at the moment. And we've a lot of work to do to try and rectify that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to make a comment on adoption as well. While it would be welcome, it's from what I understand, it's quite an intrusive process that takes a long number of years to process, and especially for families with older children who are walking and talking. I believe the children are involved in the process as well. So it's not very appropriate for families in our community. While we would welcome the ability to have the legal connection, the process as it stands seems quite inappropriate when you're applying it to families that have always existed together.
Yeah, I think the ultimate goal has to be, where you're in a committed relationship, cohabiting, single partners, married, you should have the same rights as a heterosexual couple would have in that exact situation. We have marriage equality, and we should have equality on all other footings, to make sure our families are equal and our children have the exact same rights as children of heterosexual couples. I think that has to be the main goal of I suppose, of this particular group, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of following on from that, like what needs to happen next, you know, legally speaking, in order to resolve it, so that no matter, you know, because we know there are so many permutations of families, and there are so many different ways that we've all conceived our families, and some are similar but just slightly different. And what needs to happen in order that all of our children will have a legal connection with their parents?
I think, you know, looking at this from the legal side of things for equality for children, I definitely think one of the first things that we have to look at is, you know, what are the various connotations that we're dealing with? What are the different categories that we're dealing with in terms of the LGBT plus community? You know, what are the different dynamics, the family dynamics, and so on? We have to ascertain that first, because I think that was a major issue with the 2015 Act. I don't think that was done, because if it was, there'd be, in my opinion, there would have been provision for a lot more types of families or categories, or, you know, in terms of type or category, I'm saying the makeup of the family, same-sex females, same-sex males, surrogacy, you know, all of that kind of stuff, reciprocal IVF, so on. Secondly, and this is really important, because I genuinely think one of the reasons that the legislation is causing a lot of issues is because the wording and the interpretation of that particular wording has to be clarified. And the only way, sadly, that you can really do that is to effectively, it's almost like ask the legislature, ask the state, you know, how do you interpret this? Does this apply to us? Does this apply to them? And I think that from a very literal interpretation of the legislation, I mean, there's a couple of situations where, you know, you kind of say, right, well, is that covered in the legislation? Surely the legislation was intended to cover that group or category of people, or that type of makeup of a family. But why, when I read the legislation and the specific provisions, you know, why does it appear that it doesn't? And it's clarity around what's actually meant and intended by those various provisions, but it's clarity around what the state believes those to mean, because you and I can interpret it in one way and the state might interpret it in a completely different way. And it's important for us to be able to identify that and ascertain that, because then once we do, we know exactly who's covered by the legislation, and then we can work towards any future legislation or amendments, you know, can be considered in that context. Who is covered? Okay, they're fine, and now let's work on who's not. And then I think we have to, if it's possible at all, kind of get as much information around anyone who's taken cases, bringing challenges around this legislation, if their particular families aren't recognised in law at all, be it by virtue of the 2015 Act or else, or otherwise, anyone taking cases, you know, if there's a willingness to talk to us and educate us as to what the issues are that are being litigated, it would be phenomenal, because at least then we'd be able to keep an eye on any progress that's made, or, you know, if there's relief being sought, if that's granted or denied, at least we know where things stand from a legal perspective, because obviously these are all kind of family law type cases, and a lot of them would be in camera, so we wouldn't be entitled to, I suppose, even attend or have a lot of information around them. So, you know, if anyone's willing to talk to us, that's going to be huge from our perspective.
Yeah. So it sounds like, you know, we've been doing a lot of information gathering. And Elaine, like, could you tell me a little bit, like, what have we achieved to date, you know, and what are we working on?
So at Equality for Children, as you said, Ranae, earlier, started last October, a group of parents who were just sick of it, and many of us were campaigning in our own ways before that as well. So we've raised quite a bit of awareness in the community, and I think in the wider public, especially with things like Gearoid had an interview this week in the Independent, and another one coming out in the Examiner next week. And Ranae, I know you've done many petitions and online information awareness campaigns, and there's lots of other work like that going on. We were part of the group, along with LGBT Ireland, that lobbied, protested, met with the government and pushed them to make those final amendments to the CFRA so that it could be enacted this year. And we were part of that meeting where just before Christmas, where Minister Simon Harris informed us that he would be finally signing the commencement order, and he signed it that day to enact it on May the 4th. So that was a great achievement. And I suppose since then we've been engaging with all the political parties around the election, around getting our raising the issue with TDs and senators and negotiation teams and advisors around what the issue is, because many of them, like the general public, believe this to be already sorted through marriage referendum campaign. So we got with some of the parties, we have made a lot of progress with having the issue included in their manifestos. And more recently, we've been working with the negotiation teams for the parties, specifically Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, since they're the ones who look like they might be coming up with a programme for government or getting one passed. And we have some issues that we've been lobbying for that have been included in the programme for government, which is fantastic. So the things that need to happen for equality for children and for this to all be progressed are obviously the Children and Family Relationship Act has to be fully tested, and all those families who can get parental orders, and I'm sure we'll find issues with that as we go on. But the next steps are getting the Assisted Human Reproduction Bill progressed. So that's kind of at the act stage or the bill stage. Mary could probably clarify which stage.
The bill stage.
The bill stage, yeah, not an act yet. And that's been, surrogacy there's been reports on surrogacy in Ireland since 2005, and we still don't have an act. So we really want to get that progressed. As it currently stands, it's quite a limited act as well, and it doesn't include all of the families in our community. So we will be lobbying to get it amended to include more and more families. And the other thing that we need to happen, and again, this happened through our work with the government, a special rapporteur was appointed to draw up a report on assisted human reproduction and the implications for families and in the LGBT community. So that is happening, and that was included in the programme for government. Both of those asks were included, thankfully. So that, we think, will be a significant piece of progress, because that report will be a government commissioned report, and we'll have recommendations around how to legislate for all families. So those are two significant pieces of progress, but we have to keep the pressure on and keep this issue to the forefront of the new government.
Okay, thanks. So for people watching this, hopefully, they've connected with our stories, and either they might find themselves in the same situation, or they might have friends or family members in the same situation, or they might just be able to relate to all of us just on a human level, the struggles that we're going through with our families. And if anyone wants to help us, how do they do that? How do they get involved? Gearoid, how do people help us?
Yeah, so look, there is already a group in place, as Elaine and Ranae have said, the Equality for Children group. We are a group of parents who are fighting for the rights, not of us, but of our children, to be treated the exact same as every other child in the estate or parish or community that they live in. So if you want to get involved, just contact us on Facebook, contact us through Instagram, look up our webpage. We need all sorts of help. We need people who can donate money. We need people who can donate time. We need people who might be well connected or tenuously even connected to a local politician who would be willing to talk to them or introduce us to them, so that we can have a conversation with them, or so that they can take the conversation. So have a look at our social media channels, have a look at our webpage, see what we're doing, and let us know what sort of help you can offer. As I said, we'll take time, we'll take skills, we'll take money, we'll take introductions to politicians. But this is an issue that affects, the most innocent and, I suppose, in some ways vulnerable people in our society. It affects children. And it's just not right that the state have consciously at this point decided, there was a time a couple of years ago when they said they would introduce the CFRA very quickly in order for it not to be an issue as part of marriage equality. But 5 years have passed since then, and the state are now fully aware, because of the lobbying and petitioning that we have done through Equality for Children, they're fully aware of the families that are just completely ignored and left out. And that's just not right. It's just not fair to do that to children. So please just come on board and give us whatever you think you can offer, because we just need all hands on deck. We've done an amazing amount in 8 months, but there's so much more to do, and we just need to keep the pressure on and just get this over the line. And going back to the original point that Ranae made at the very start, how dare the state tell us how we can have our children? They wouldn't dare do that to any heterosexual couple. It's just not right that they have laid out all of these terms and conditions that apply when a homosexual LGBT plus couple decides that they want to become parents. It's just not right. So please come on board and give us the help that we need to get this over the line.
Okay, thanks. So basically, we need you to volunteer, we need your money, and we need you to help us raising awareness. So those are the three things. And, every single person has something to give, big or small, whatever your skill set, we can use every little bit of help. And as we've all said, it's not about us. It's not about us as parents and as adults. It's about, our vulnerable children, and it's about protecting them. So unless anyone else has anything to add, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I just want to say a huge thank you to GCN for hosting this event and for their continued involvement and support for our campaign. They have just been there every step of the way for us, and we just want to thank them so much for that. I know that they have a full week of events lined up, and we will certainly be tuning in for those. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and please get in touch with us. Have an amazing Pride Week. Enjoy it. Stay safe. And remember, no one is equal until we all are. Thanks, guys.